youth and adult literacy and numeracy skills on a large scale. We will also identify possible ways of introducing a skill assessment survey in interested countries. Session 1, that will start just now, will establish the importance of numeracy and literacy assessment. In that session, we will also be presenting a tool for literacy and numeracy assessment, the so-called mini-LAMP, in 2 new modalities being developed currently by UAL. Session 2 will focus on the practical implementation of youth and adult numeracy and literacy assessments, as well as implications for policy making. It will bring together experts from Ireland, the Republic of Korea, and France, who have kindly agreed to share with us their experience of large-scale survey implementation. I encourage you to use the subsequent discussion as a platform to share your own thoughts and concerns, as well as ask questions to the experts present with us today. This webinar is an opportunity for all of us to deepen our understanding of the status quo and recent advances in skills assessment, to identify challenges, but also to explore ideas for member states and other stakeholders to strengthen their skills data in order to contribute to better informed, more effective and inclusive policymaking. I thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I wish us all a very stimulating and rich discussion. It's now my pleasure to invite my colleague Rakat Zoldoshalieva, team leader at UL, to moderate the first session. Thanks and welcome to all again.
Thank you so much, David. And without ado, we will start then right away session number 1. And I will be the moderator of this session, as David has mentioned. This session 1 will be responding to the question why and how to assess youth and adult literacy and numeracy. We have 2 speakers in this session. I would like to invite the speaker number 1, Mr. Ido Gal, Associate Professor at the University of Haifa. Ido has an extensive experience in international collaborative work. He has chaired the Numeracy Expert Group at the OECD Survey of Adult Skills, known as PIAC, and led the numeracy team of the Adult Literacy and Life Skills Survey, which is also known as ALF. I would like to invite Ido to speak to the topic of adult numeracy and a neglected field. Over to you, Ido.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everybody. Thank you for inviting me to participate. Let me share my screen here and my slides. Just a moment, please. Okay, can you see this?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Okay, very well. So we think that adult numeracy is a neglected field in the discussions on educational development, international development. And I would like to speak very briefly about 3 sub-issues. This is a huge area, so I would like to give a few examples for why numeracy matters. I would like to speak briefly about the connection between numeracy and SDG 4.6 and present some ideas for action that can be elaborated later on in the discussion, because I only have a few minutes. And so numeracy matters in many parts of life, and people need to cope with many situations and exercise problem solving and make decisions on small and large situations. Numeracy matters in the workplace, in decisions about safety and efficiency and how to handle different kinds of situations. And sometimes people make mistakes because of this. And numeracy is essential if people are expected to take advantage of opportunities that are offered to them by governments or by other donors and try to improve their economic well-being or social well-being, especially with regard to women in developing countries and other contexts. And numeracy is changing all the time, as David already mentioned, and people need to be able to take advantage of new digital tools to collaborate, to understand global marketplaces, they need to get trained on many issues in order to come up to speed and so on. So numeracy is changing as we speak. Numeracy is essential for understanding what is happening in the environment around you, global warming, climate change, pollution issues, and so on. And people sometimes need to take action and participate in community action in this regard. And numeracy is essential for people to understand health crisis and pandemics and so forth. And governments need to be able to communicate complex information, very advanced information, to whole populations in simple ways, and discuss the distribution of different kinds of phenomena and what it means for individuals. So numeracy is all around us, and it matters. And what matters for us here is that we need to know more about the distribution of numeracy. And it matters a great deal if your country looks like the distribution on the left, with most people at the lower end, or whether the distribution is like the one in the middle or on the right-hand side. This has huge consequences for people and for economies and for societies. So this is why numeracy is part of SDG 4.6, but we face many needs and gaps and challenges in this regard. So as already was mentioned, numeracy is part of target 4.6, which mentions literacy and numeracy as two separate areas, and there needs to be a monitoring or indicator system for that. But notice that there are additional indicators pertaining to the school level which discuss mathematics and not numeracy. And mathematics and numeracy are related but not the same thing. And many countries may think that if they invest in improving mathematical education at the school level, it will improve the numeracy level of adults. And this is not really so, because it takes many, many years for this to happen. And even then, mathematics education at the school level very often does not touch on the full scope of what numeracy is about. So for many years, numeracy was not really on the table in international discussions, and UNESCO itself subsumed numeracy within literacy, referring only to computation and to nothing else. But numeracy is a much broader construct. There are multiple definitions. This is a short one that I developed to fit a single slide. So numeracy is a motivational construct and a cognitive construct. It refers to both the willingness and the ability to engage and to manage different types of situations, to read critically and think about the quality of the information and its meaning and interpretations, and make decisions in this regard. And we can talk about multiple domains where numeracy is needed. It is needed in various aspects that have to do with personal finance or family finance and commercial life, in the workplace, in digital environments, and understanding information that flows through digital means. It is important in many health contexts and in civic contexts, as we illustrated. But we know very little about this. There are over 200 countries in the world, and most of them have no information whatsoever about the distribution of numeracy skills in the population. Most countries also don't have a lot of information on the literacy levels of the citizens, and they use either self-reports or some proxy measures. Only about 40 countries or so have either participated or will participate in PIAC, the OECD survey of adult skills. Last cycle was a few years ago, and the next cycle is in 2024, and we will hear more about PIAC later today. And only 4 countries completed the original LAMP assessments in 2009, and I will give a brief example for one of them. There are some countries that develop their own national assessments suitable for their own needs, and we will get some examples from France in this regard today, but there are some other middle income or low income countries such as Kenya and Bangladesh that also develop their own assessments. And countries may know more about the distribution of skills in school populations, perhaps through PISA or PISA for development. But even this covers much less than 50% of the number of world countries. So a lot remains to be known. And I want to illustrate some of the issues that are involved in measuring numeracy and why we need to do it by using some data from LAMP, which was an assessment that was originally fielded more than 10 years ago by UNESCO and UNESCO Institute for Statistics. So if we just look at the results for Jordan, the first country, top line, we see that 25% of the population was classified in level 1, but we don't really know where they are in level 1, and half of the population was in level 2, but many of them were on the lower end of level 2. We see quite big gaps between males and females in this regard, which is typical of quite a few countries, not all countries, but some, suggesting that you cannot really look at national averages. You need to be able to measure things differently because there are huge differences in terms of demands. This percentage translates to hundreds of thousands of women in Jordan that needs extra training. And about 50% of the people with primary education were at level 1, but it means that many of them were at higher levels. They improved the skills through other life experiences or non-formal learning opportunities. So using formal proxies or formal education credentials does not necessarily tell us where they are in terms of numeracy. And we also know that the opposite is true because there are people who have completed high schools and they are still at level 1 in numeracy. So we need direct measures and not just to rely on proxy skills in this regard. So I want to jump to some recommendations. They are actually summarized as well in the UIL policy brief number 13, which was released at the end of 2020. And you are welcome to look at more information there, where you can find more references for more documents to discuss this arena. So I just want to focus here on a few selected points. First, countries need to ask themselves, what is the long-range strategy in terms of adult education and adult learning? And some of the learning may take place outside formal context, but in more functional contexts, such as in financial education or health education, and so on. The recommendation for developing an adult skills strategy has been promoted and adopted by OECD and the European Commission and other countries and the World Bank, and certainly is relevant for all world countries. But numeracy needs to be a separate aspect of this. And this is very challenging because many countries do not have many experts in adult numeracy. So what they do, they bring people who are familiar with mathematics education at the school level and expect them to educate adults, and very often this doesn't work very well. The other challenge is to monitor numeracy in an effective way that is suitable for the demographic and linguistic diversity of each country. And as we mentioned earlier, there aren't currently many tools that are available, but today we will hear more about the mini LAMP as an option that is emerging right now. And many countries may need to resort to additional solutions that rely on developing a very short module focused on numeracy that will be administered as part of an ongoing national survey, and using a more elaborate and sophisticated system of self-ratings, and we are beginning to work on this angle. There needs to be a lot of capacity building, and part of it is finding experts that can help in developing assessments for adults and not for children. And many people who are familiar with assessing school-level mathematical knowledge are not familiar with assessing adult numeracy. So there needs to be some pooling of resources. There are many good documents in this regard at the international arena that provide guidance. And maybe you can rely on some experts from neighboring countries. And finally, you must have a long-range plan, because this requires sustainable funding and finding a team of people who will be dedicated and work for a few years until you are able to generate both a strategy and a monitoring tool that suits your situation. So there are many more issues that are associated with this arena. This is only a very superficial description, but I hope that it is sufficient for this part of the webinar, and I'm happy to answer additional questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ido. You were on time, to be honest. Thank you so much for sticking to the time. As you have heard, Ido's topic was about the neglected field of adult numeracy, and he has highlighted that we have published policy number 13 with the title Adult Numeracy Assessment and Development. We'd like all the participants to invite to check this policy brief with more information in more detail as well. And I want to remind before going to the next speaker that we have, after the second session, we will have discussion where we will be interacting with the speakers of session 1 and 2. Thank you so much. For now, you can start posing your question in question and answer box. Thank you. I would like to invite the second speaker to this session, my colleague, Mr. Nikolai Jonas. Nikolai is a program specialist at the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. He'll be speaking about a UNESCO instrument that's called Minilamp. Nikolai, over to you. Thank you so much. Nikolai will be speaking in French. Please, if you haven't done the change in the interpretation, you have to do it. Thank you so much. Choose English. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Rakat.
Thank you very much, Rakat. Let me just take a few seconds to share my screen with you. I hope everyone can see this clearly now. Fine, it seems to be working. So what I'll be talking about is what is going on globally concerning adult literacy and numeracy, and I'll be reporting on a UNESCO instrument called Minilamp, and it's something that is a response to some of the challenges in this field. So let's firstly look at this rather scary figure. It's adult illiteracy population. 772 million people over 15 today are considered illiterate. So what does that figure actually mean, and how do we get to it? You have to realize that the bulk of this is based on an estimate. It's not a direct measurement of skills. It's reached using a statistical model that has generated so far this figure of 772 million. Another important factor in this figure is that it covers people who can neither read nor write, whereas as part of 4.6 of SDGs, it's not illiteracy but functional illiteracy that is being measured. So there are people that can perhaps read and write a little, but not enough to get by in ordinary life. So if you add that to the people who can't read or write at all, means you have a higher figure of people with problems, which means that it's vital to use the necessary tools for measuring adult skills. Most often what we do is used declaratory, census-based figures. Let me show you the kind of differences in the accuracy or quality of the data depending on what you're using. So let's go back to the Cambodian census in 1998. It was a full population census, and the question was whether people in the household could read or not. And this produces 1/3 illiterate and 2/3 literate. In 1999, they then went to direct measurement of adult literacy. And it's very interesting when you compare the two pie charts, because the share of the population considered literate is slightly higher in the second than the first derivative, which is a very well-known phenomenon, because when you're talking about a self-declaratory survey, there's a tendency to underestimate. And it's also interesting to see that in the 2/3 of the population that was considered literate, there's actually a continuum that goes from flimsy skills right the way through to full mature literacy. So there's a continuous range across this. And the same is true of numeracy. And there are a lot of things, therefore, that get missed using traditional surveys or measurement systems. If today you look at the number of countries that have used specific literacy surveys, you see there aren't many countries that can produce good quality data, only 1/3. And there are big differences, geographically speaking, in the Asian Pacific region. You have the same proportion, 22 countries that have this sort of survey. In Africa, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, where there's high literacy, in sub-Saharan Africa, you see that it's a rather more worrying situation because only 4 countries so far have brought in this kind of skills survey. And if you go to Latin America, you find levels below the global average. 7 out of 32 countries have run this kind of survey, whereas a large number of European, North American countries have organized this kind of very accurate survey. So what exactly do these countries do? Well, most of the time we're talking international surveys, PIAC from OECD, or STEP by the World Bank, or the LAMP survey by UNESCO, which is no longer being used. So as Professor Gall, a lot of the time they're just national surveys. In both cases, in the cases of countries with just national surveys, you have literacy and numeracy data, and there are a few countries, 13%, that have been able to run both types of surveys, international, which enables comparisons and makes it possible to follow what other countries have done. So you can see the number of countries that have done that. What is interesting to see is why so few surveys have been organized. This is something that you find across most skill surveys. The thing is, they are highly demanding in terms of resources, very expensive because they're long-term surveys, and they are very technically demanding. So it means that underlying this, you have to have a strong statistics system. You have to have researchers, specialists in very advanced and very different areas, so as to organize an efficient survey, giving you the kind of results you're looking for. The next challenge, in particular international surveys, is lack of flexibility. It's easy to understand because to be international, the aim is to be comparable. So these surveys have to be standardized to a certain extent, which can be quite a burden on countries because that means that they cannot have add-ons specific to their national situation or their long-term context. And very often, these surveys lack the necessary flexibility that countries would like. Then the third major challenge, very briefly, is that these international surveys that we have at the moment are based on a definition and level of skills that has to be shared across countries, which means that missing out on the country's specific needs, they might have their own targets that they'd like to aim for. And then the fourth major problem in international surveys is ownership. In many cases, the countries don't actually own the questions in the questionnaire, and they cannot reuse them or adjust them, and they cannot buy into the statistical models that are used to measure adult skills. So they're not reproducible. At the end of the day, it's a problem. So on the basis of these challenges, we can perhaps understand why there are very few countries that run this kind of direct comparison. And it was for this that UNESCO decided to develop a mini lamp based on the previous lamp. The thing is, it obviously involves a cognitive questionnaire, but its advantage is very short, only 15 questions covering both literacy and numeracy. And these questions were tested in LAMP using 10 different languages, so it's fair to say that their validity has been confirmed. And because it's short, mini LAMP can be used standalone or in conjunction with a pre-existing survey which considerably reduces costs. Also, mini LAMP consists of a biographic or background questionnaire, which is very short and focuses mainly on professional uses of literacy and numeracy, and is easily tailorable to each country's needs in conjunction with the other questions they want to add. And it's fair to say that the methodology is sound. It's been tried and tested through the full-scale LAMP, and all of this can be delivered to countries with documentation and guidelines which enable countries to comply with the basic quality criteria, but also provides advice about how the survey can be adapted to country-specific needs. And last but not least, there are statistics software tools that go with this and can be provided to countries. Last thing, that's one of the major advantages of mini-LAMP. It's different from other surveys by being more flexible. There are 3 ways of using it. Conventional paper and pencil based, using a pre-designed questionnaire that has been formatted that can be shared with countries, along with guidelines for training in administration, scoring and coding. The second way it can be used is tablet-based. It's multilingual, nomad in its implementation, and it doesn't require high levels of connectivity, so it's something that can be configured into all the languages that a country might want and apply it to both literacy and numeracy. And one last format that's being developed is the phone-based one, which is very advantageous. It doesn't cover the full adult literacy and numeracy spectrum, but it does mean that you can reach people in very remote areas that perhaps you can't get to for security or health reasons. And using the phone-based system, you can relatively cheaply get to people who would cost too much to reach using a traditional survey, or who are just in general excluded from this sort of investigation. UIL obviously supports this. That's the UNESCO Institute of Lifelong Learning, and we can give you additional information about this if you're interested. And UIL can also provide targeted technical advice across all the stages of the survey. But it's easy to see that international surveys don't cover all specific needs, and here UIL can help countries develop their own instruments for their own specific needs. And depending on the response, what the level of interest is, we might be able to provide training so that countries can take ownership of this tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicolas, for a very interesting presentation about starting from the global picture of direct assessments according to different regions, and also introducing us to mini-LAMP. As Nicolas has highlighted, that if you have any further questions about this instrument, about the modalities that he has been presenting about, please contact UIL for further information. We'll be happy to respond to your questions. I would like now to conclude this session which actually responded to the questions of why and how to assess youth and adult literacy and numeracy. And I would like to thank both of the speakers, but I would like to keep them here because we'll be returning back to the speakers when discussion session will be open. Thank you so much, Ido. Thank you so much, Nicola. Now I would like to introduce to the moderator of the next session on the country presentations. My colleague, Nicola Jonas, will be moderating this session with 3 speakers. Over to you, Nicola. I want to remind you that we are a little bit beyond the time for the sessions. Yeah, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Raka.
Thank you, Raka. It's a great pleasure to introduce this second session of the webinar, which will be the lengthier one. And we will be looking at country experiences, countries that have already performed a direct skills assessment. And this is a key issue for us all, and I'm sure you'll be interested in knowing to what extent having more precise data can contribute to better policies and better practices in the area of literacy and numeracy. So to address this issue, I have the great pleasure of welcoming 3 speakers who will be talking about 3 countries in very different situations. So Ireland, the Republic of Korea, and France. Before I give the floor to our first speaker on the panel, I'd like to recall that you can ask questions in the Q&A tab. Do not hesitate to ask questions. We will address them at the end of the session. So the first speaker is Colleen Dube from the NALA in Ireland, the National Adult Literacy Agency. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good day, good evening, everyone. It is my privilege to join you today from Ireland. Let me just share my screen, if you bear with me 1 minute. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to speak about Ireland's experience of the Programme for International Assessment the Programme for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. Sorry, we're just having a little technical issue here. There we go. So basically, I'm going to tell you firstly a little bit about the National Adult Literacy Agency, of which I am the Chief Executive Officer for the last 7 months. Also to give you a very rapid history of the evolution of adult literacy in Ireland, and to talk more specifically about our experiences of PIAC, the findings and impact, and where that has led us today. So the National Adult Literacy Agency, for those of you who are not familiar, was established in 1980 as a membership organization to tackle adult literacy issues. It has emerged from a 1970s grassroots volunteer effort, and in our estimation, has equated literacy with the education and social inclusion and human rights of individuals. NALA is now a membership organization with close to 2,500 members, but we are also a company limited by guarantee and registered charity with an operating budget of about 2.6 million annually. Apologies. Sorry there. So our mission is to advocate for literacy as a right and to collaborate with many partners throughout Ireland and internationally to influence policy and practice and to support the development of literacy, numeracy, and digital skills. As you can see from just the lower end, we're engaged in quite a lot of activity from research, also the actual delivery of literacy through a distance learning platform, and as well as an online platform called Learn with NALA. And NALA has also been instrumental in research and policy and influencing policy, which I'll speak of subsequently. We have a very wide definition of literacy as visualized there, and literacy encompasses not only just core literacy, but also numeracy and digital skills. And as Ido had mentioned, it looks at literacy, numeracy, and digital across many, many domains. So I'm going to do just a very rapid fire kind of overview of how literacy has evolved in Ireland to kind of situate the current situation. Ireland, as you may know, is a small open economy, and it's reliant substantially on foreign direct investment, which has huge impact in differentiating between our gross national product and our gross domestic product. The population currently is about 5 million, with 84% Roman Catholic and about 12% non-Irish nationals. Currently, even though with all the impact of COVID, we're projecting GDP growth of about 4.2%. Once again, this is largely due to the impact of foreign companies in Ireland. Employment, even allowing for certain COVID unemployment rates, is still quite high, with 70% employed. Inequality is on par with OECD countries, but as we'll talk about when we look at the specific literacy data, we have an aging population and persistent pockets of inequality. And this is particularly evident if we look at some recent UNICEF statistics, where 14% of the population is at risk of falling below the poverty line. And when we do look at literacy, we do see these links between literacy and inequality. So this is just a bit of a visual snapshot of some of how literacy has evolved in Ireland. Ireland has a reputation of the land of saints and scholars and an educated population. And we've gone through boom and bust in terms of economic growth and fall in the last kind of 20 years. And currently we can see these kind of disparities with rising homelessness in many of our urban cities, but then the emergence of what we would call Silicon Docks, with the concentration of major international technical companies throughout Ireland, but particularly in Dublin. Apologies. So very briefly, for those of you who are aware, Ireland in the mid-19th century actually had one of the earliest primary school systems set up by the then ruling British government. And literacy was first measured in Ireland as part of the census in 1841. But as we've heard, the census data can give just very generalized data. And we had a sense that 47% of the population could read. But it's important to note that Irish was still the dominant language at that time. So we didn't have a kind of very precise definition of what literacy meant, whether it was to read or to write or both. There was a period once Irish independence was established in 1922, that there was a belief that there was the limited education and literacy was deemed sufficient. And once again, literacy and education was largely confined to primary education and largely for economic development. And this persisted with the establishment of what was be known as the Free State, or the Irish independent government, in the late 20s into the 30s, and the establishment of vocational educational schools, which concentrated primarily on providing technical education for those under 18, with no provision for adults. And by the time the Irish Republic was established in 1947, there was a belief that we had a very strong education system that was appropriate to the needs of the country, as outlined by a quote there from the Minister of Education. And there was a belief persisting into the 1960s that the Irish population was universally literate. And as we'll find as we go into the 1970s, that this changed. And once we started having some data emerging, that those assumptions were flawed. So coming into the 1970s, the first report on adult education found that there were literacy difficulties, and there were a number of recommendations, including more research. And this led slowly to the establishment of literacy organizations throughout Ireland at a grassroots movement, really where literacy was equated with literacy and education was equated with the human right. And it's out of that context that NALA emerged. And following an economic recession in the 1990s and Ireland joining the European Commission, the emphasis started to change and focus on literacy. And then one of the first surveys we had in 1997 created a new context for literacy in Ireland. It was the first international study and created an evidence base. And 55% of those between 16 and 64 were scoring below the minimum desired level. This was met with utter shock and disbelief. The notion of Ireland as saints and scholars with a international education system was being called into question. And this led to rises in increased investment in education and the first junior minister for adult education. And you can see these developments coming into the early part of the 20th century. But really, it wasn't until PIAC in 2012 that there was concerted understanding about the levels of literacy and the work that needed to be done. Right. And the PIAC findings were quite shocking. As evidence there, 1 in 6 adults had difficulty with basic literacy. So that was 18% of Irish adults were scoring below level 1, so roughly 500,000. Similarly with numeracy, and there we saw the numbers going up to 750,000. And these numbers still persist in terms of what we can aggregate out of kind of CSO data, because obviously PIAC has not been repeated, but as we've heard earlier in the presentations, is due to start again next year. So for the Irish government, this was a wake-up call in terms of Ireland amongst its European counterparts, scoring 17th out of 18. And you can see in this graph here, just above Poland and Germany. So this led to kind of a concerted level of activity. And it was the first time that there was strong evidence that participating in mainstream education was not enough, and work needed to be on literacy. It was a particular catalyst for NALA's own efforts in terms of lobbying, membership drives, and bringing awareness to campaigns for systematic change. And it led to further research, looking at where were the particular issues in terms of literacy. And we saw in terms of a study in 2014 that there was greater levels of literacy need amongst women, older workers, and semi-skilled and lower skilled members of the workforce. So this led over that period from 2022, significant developments even within the last 2 years. In 2020, the Irish government committed to developing a 10-year strategy for adult literacy, numeracy, and digital skills. And as we heard earlier in Ido's presentation, this is a critical need in terms of looking at things longitudinally and over a long period of time in terms of provision and investment. There was also a commitment to what we call a plain language requirement to make sure that particularly all government services are in language that is accessible and able to be understood by people who have unmet literacy, numeracy, and digital needs. This also led to a series of very focused publications on behalf of NALA. I won't go into those in specific. You can find further details on our website, nala.ie, where we're looking at the policies and practices, as well as advocating for a whole of government approach and particular monitoring frameworks that we hope to see in place with the new strategy. Then in September of last year, the government launched the strategy, and then there's a quote there from the current Minister for Further Education, who has responsibility for this, about the importance of this being a whole of government to ensure that there's awareness of literacy as an issue and how best government and other stakeholders can tackle this issue over the next 10 years. So where are we now? NALA and a range of organizations and stakeholders have been part of a very extensive consultative process. NALA made a submission and has been continuing to work with government partners on a draft strategy, which we hope will be launched within the next 2 weeks. And you can read our kind of submissions on this once again on our website. Minister Harris spoke at our annual general meeting and has spoken with sincerity and commitment about his department and all government departments tackling unmet literacy, numeracy, and digital needs. And as I said, we are hoping the strategy will be launched earlier this year. And as you can hear, Reggie, our dog, is very excited about the strategy to be launched. But there are still very worrying statistics. Literacy provision in Ireland, currently, there's approximately 60,000 enrolled in literacy, and based on the statistics we have, that is only 15% of those requiring support. So a considerable mismatch between supply and demand. Other PIAC studies have shown that we're seeing a stagnation of skills, where once people leave secondary education, their skills are not keeping par within the workforce. And we have taken some proxy data from the Central Statistics Office that there are over 400,000 with less than a level 4 qualification, and 52% of those work, which means that there are still unmet gaps in terms of literacy and numeracy. And a recent CEDAPOP survey, which I have visualized there, shows that currently 14% of Irish individuals have never used a computer. They have just under 40% basic digital literacy, and still we're looking at kind of 20-25% in terms of low literacy and numeracy needs. So where does that leave us now? So really, just to conclude, PIAC, like the International Adult Literacy Service in 1997, had profound impact on stimulating not only NALA, but the Irish government's attention and interventions. It moved things from assumption to action. There are ongoing challenges in terms of keeping data current to inform our ongoing policy, to make sure that we have integrated learner-centered data so that learners are not put off by the either data gathering processes or even the assessment processes, so that we can get more accurate data. And also looking at softer qualitative outcome indicators. I'm heartened to see by PIAC in terms of looking at some of those softer assessment indicators in the next plan survey. But we also need to look, as Ido spoke of, what are those motivational issues, not just the kind of cognitive and communication skills, but also why people will engage in learning. And as visualized there, it is a bit of a kind of perfect triangle in terms of ensuring that there's political will, a positive economy, and the evidence. And organizations such as NALA constantly kind of stirring the pot to make sure that there is change. So progress on indicators and evidence will be subject to this ongoing persistence and persuasion, as well as consistent and committed political will and favorable economic conditions and investment. Thank you very much. Guramagu.
Thank you very much, Colleen, for this extremely rich presentation. And it was interesting to see how the work on literacy and numeracy was historically constructed, how all stakeholders have contributed to the emergence of the issue and the importance of a clear definition, and the focus on the need for clear data and how data collection has contributed to walking the talk. This was a twofold process. First, shock in the face of such information, and it's really a moment of reckoning to then engage in action, and which is a second step, taking the right measures and using all tools at our disposal, legislative tools, strategies, etc. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to return to this example during the Q&A session. I have the great pleasure now to give the floor to Mrs. Min-Son Park, Republic of Korea, who will be presenting the example of the Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this webinar today. So first of all, let me briefly explain what the National Institute for Lifelong Education does and go on to my topic. So about NILE, or National Institute for Lifelong Education, we are a exclusive organization. We're a public organization under the Ministry of Education in charge of implementing lifelong learning policies in Korea. And our mission is to contribute to the inclusive growth and innovation of Korea through providing and promoting lifelong learning for everyone in all stages of their life. And just the brief history of illiteracy eradication in Korea. So in 1945, right after our independence from Japanese colonization, our illiteracy rate was at 78%, or more like 3/4 of the country was deemed illiterate. The rate went down dramatically to about 20% in 1960s, and it was also reduced more dramatically to almost 1% in 2020. Can you go back to the first slide, please? Thank you. And about what we mean by literacy in Korea is, first of all, we have a definition for literacy education in our law, Lifelong Education Act. And under this law, it defines literacy as a basic skills necessary for daily life, which includes not only literacy attainment, but also all sorts of basic life skills, which you need to have to lead a leading life. And also, if you see my slides, we do have definition for literacy education, which is defined as a structured education programs that are aimed to provide one with socially and culturally required basic skills, which we need to maintain a daily life, which also includes a literacy levels. Next slide, please. So about the status of adult literacy in Korea, we have 2 national surveys on the status of adult literacy. First is what we call Adult Literacy Competency Survey, which is conducted by our organization, NILE. So beginning in 2014, we conduct a national survey on the status of adult literacy, targeting adults aged from 18 and older. And in 2017 survey, the survey has been conducted in 2014, 17, and last year, 2020. And last year's results are out. However, it is still not open to public. And the results will be published and open to public later this year. And so what you see on the screen is the results from the 2017 survey, which was the second survey that we conducted. So basically for this national survey, we assess adult literacy competency levels by gender, age groups, educational attainments, and their monthly household income, and the region. And for this survey, the literacy areas are defined or classified into a prose, quantitative, and document. By document, we mean ability to understand a posi or official documents that you see in daily life. And the results of the 2017 surveys are shown as on the screen. And what we mean, we divide all these literacy levels into the 4 stages, from level 1 to level 4. Basically, level 1 means that the person has almost no literacy ability to be able to perform a very basic tasks in reading, writing, and numeracy. And we defined it as those with a literacy level of primary school grades 1 or 2 level or below. Second level means they can perform basic tasks. However, it is not adequate enough to lead a relatively normal life in daily lives. But for example, by using a public, being able to understand the public documents or financial documents, etc. Level 3, by level 3, we mean that it is adequate enough for family and recreational life and conducting a somewhat basic tasks in public and financial areas. However, it is still not adequate enough to be able to work and complete tasks in public and financial areas. And by that, we define this as almost up to the level of middle school grades, up to 9th grade in middle school. And for level 4 and those above this level, which we deem that the person is able to lead a relatively normal life, performing daily tasks with adequate levels of literacy. And we found that in 2017 survey showed that we still had learners with a literacy level lower than level 1, which is almost illiterate at 7.2%, which is quite a large number if you think. So next slide, please. In addition to the adult literacy status survey, we have another survey, national survey, which is called the Literacy Education Institution Survey. This survey is another national survey that we collect based on our laws of Lifelong Education Act. And unlike the adult literacy status survey, this is conducted every year. And I wasn't able to get the latest data, but this is the data from 2018. And this survey investigates or surveys institutional status of the institutions that provide literacy education throughout the country, programs, learners, and others such as requirements for supporting the learners as well as the institutional improvements. Next slide, please. So the reason we have a separate, this is a separate survey from the OECD or PIAC survey that we also do participate in PIAC and other international surveys. However, the surveys I mentioned before are purely conducted by the Korean government in Korea for the purpose of determining the current status, the actual status of learners and their needs in Korea. And from the data we collect, we try to determine the areas of needs and other areas of needs and try to implement those results into the policy, the education policy of Korea. So basically, the literacy education policy is still a large part of Korean education policy agendas in Korea. And although one may think that literacy education is not really one of the most important areas, however, the results that show from these surveys that we conduct every 3 years, it shows that illiteracy rate is still quite high among what we call traditionally vulnerable groups, such as women and elderly. The data is not shown on my presentation. However, our latest data in 2017 showed that the male illiteracy rate was merely at 0.5%, the female illiteracy rate was almost 6 times higher than that of male illiteracy rate at 2.8%. And additionally, the results always show that the elderly groups tend to show higher illiteracy rates. By elderly, we mean those in their 50s up to their 80s, showing that those in 60s had 4.66% of illiteracy rate and 20.2% for in their 70s. However, the rates were almost zero for younger generations, those in their 20s and 30s. And also we have another issues in adult literacy education, or what we call we have a new groups coming, and those are in needs of illiteracy education support, such as migrant workers and foreign spouses. And also, not shown here, we also have issues of North Korean refugees because we have varying levels of different vocabularies. So they are also another group, those in needs of literacy education in Korea. Next slide, please. And having these two national surveys help Korea gather data for the Korean government to determine what exactly is the status, the problem of literacy in Korea, and make it possible for the government, for the Ministry of Education, and also for NILE to determine which groups of learners needs more help or most help, and in terms of the regional and regional support as well. And this is all for my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bach, for this presentation. It's quite an inspiration to see what the Republic of Korea has done, the way it's institutionalized this sort of skills survey. You're already up to number 3. I think it's one of the rare examples that I'm aware of where a national skills survey is not just about determining status, a snapshot, but to organize the follow-up. As I say, it's very inspiring. And the second thing I note, which was of particular interest and promising, is your ability to link this to a survey of adult education institutes, which means that you can integrate adult education in the broader issue of lifelong learning. And in both cases, therefore, these are exemplary models that others would do well to follow. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll come back to you for the Q&A session. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the third and last speaker in this session, Elvis Fernandez, who is the French National Director for the Institute Combating Illiteracy. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for inviting us to this webinar where we're sharing experience. I want to say something about what we're doing to make sure that people are guaranteed to have this, at least a basic level of skills. It's very important to focus on this functional literacy level, which enables people to be independent and remain in control of their lives. So when it comes to sharing our experience, I would just say something about what this French National Agency for Combating Illiteracy does. And we'll try to explain how we get and use our data about people who are facing problems with illiteracy. And I'll try to explain why this data is relevant and how it contributes to including combating literacy in our overall education policies. And I will try to explain why politicians decided to use this direct specific form of measurement, because what we do is in competition with international surveys when it comes to the decision-making process has to be taken on board. I'll try to explain how these decisions are taken. In our country, we feel that if you can't measure a problem, it doesn't exist. This means that illiteracy, if it's not measured, is invisible, whereas in fact it affects 7% of adults from 18 to 65 years old, 2.5 million people who live in very different circumstances and conditions. And thanks to a survey, a direct survey on illiteracy in everyday life, for these people from 18 to 65, it shows that the older you get, the harder things are. Our country has decided to focus on people who've all gone to school in France. And even though they went through the French school system, they didn't master this functional literacy, understand everything that they read and be able to write so as to be independent in everyday life. So it's a phenomenon that could be considered invisible because it's different from people who are completely illiterate, who haven't gone to school, or people who are learning French. And our agency is focusing on highlighting this problem by providing decision makers with data, and also put a face on this invisible phenomenon through direct measurement. As I said, half of these people, half of the 2.5 million people, are in jobs. They work and they have professional responsibilities. More than half of them are over 45, and they live in fairly unpopulated areas, remote areas. So for this reason too, they're invisible. And our role is about saying, well, since these people are working and living in different areas, well, we have to involve as many different stakeholders. And so we hope that we can work with everybody who can help solve the problem, in particular work with young people who are learning or training for a profession. Working with employees in companies is very important. So it's about a cohesive approach to get everybody who can contribute to it in the most efficient way possible. And the last thing that is missing too is tools. So we don't have the basic tools for detecting illiteracy. So it's not just about producing the numbers. We are trying to find solutions. So it's a coalition-based approach. And our slogan is unite to act more efficiently. So we have to start with a basic shared definition of illiteracy. As far as we see it, there are 4 different degrees. The first is what we call structural benchmarks. Maybe we need to go back to the 3rd slide, please. Then it's about mastering basic skills in general. And third and fourth levels are about having these skills in the information society. With all our partners, about 100 different organizations that we work with, because our organization is quite small. It's only about 20 people working for our agency, but we all use this shared definition.
So a definition of illiteracy, the measurement of literacy and trend analysis to see where the needs are and where we can act. So the tools we have at our disposal are twofold. There's the information and daily life survey. So this is a survey that was launched in 2004. There was a preparatory phase that gave us the information that 9% of people between the ages of 18 and 65 were illiterate, and it's our colleague from the agency who's been working on this issue for years now, who's been instrumental in putting this issue of illiteracy measurement on the table, and he is the one that provides the tests and to measure illiteracy. So there's this survey for people between the age of 18 and 65. So there was a first survey in 2004, second survey in 2012, 9% in 2004, and 7% in 2012, so a 20% drop. And today we're working on a new iteration, but the tool to assess the literacy that we have provided to the French statistics organization is based on the definition of eradicating illiteracy. Well, there'll be a new survey, a European level survey, and so literacy will be included in the adult education survey at European level. There'll be a test phase at the end of this year, and results should be made available early 2023. And so this will give us longitudinal data on illiteracy. So the illiteracy test has become a reference survey, and it is now distributed at regional level. Indeed, in France, the IVQ survey, information and daily life, is now rolled out in 10 regions, and our colleague Mr. Gentot has disseminated the methodology also amongst private stakeholders to measure illiteracy. And with such direct measurement through our partnership with the INSEE National Statistics Institute, we can query databases and gather more direct information, more direct than the OECD type studies. We therefore can use all the biographical data that was gathered during tests and see how that correlates with reading and writing skills. And with such data, we have observed that 70% of people considered as illiterate spoke French at home when they were under the age of 5, whereas up until now, we would focus mainly on migrant populations that did not speak French at home. But this data contradicts that idea and helped us reorient our policies. This direct measurement of illiteracy is also cheaper than the other methods. So we had to struggle hard to access funding to carry out the survey in 2012. And so we understood that we were competing with the PIAC study for funding. We were told that PIAC was sufficient and that literacy was addressed in the PIAC study. Well, we were against this approach because for us, well, PIAC is about benchmarking, and it does not provide us with information about people who are no longer illiterate, the link to biographical data, and so it was a black box. We had no sovereignty on our tests. We can reuse test or test data to look at illiteracy, for example, in the economic sectors, and so, or in specific territories in France. So we wanted to ensure that we had a clear methodology that was a shared methodology so that data was comparable. And the Ministry of Education is gathering data also on the occasion of the National Defense Day, which is what replaced the drafting. So the idea is to put a face on the figures and truly understand who these illiterate people are. So there's a lot of funds invested in developing basic skills at European level. So this means in France, 15 million euros over the past 10 years invested in basic skill development. There are 150,000 people who have benefited from a basic skill enhancement. And so when the government decided to distribute this funding in France, well, they turned towards us to see where the needs were at regional level. So this was very useful for the government to better understand where they needed to funnel funds. And direct measurement also meant that we contributed to making the combat against illiteracy a national cause, meaning that there were advocacy campaigns, awareness-raising campaigns, and that was the case in 2013. And 2021 is also a year dedicated to these efforts, following a study on reading skills in France. Direct measurement also means that there's a change in the way we act and communicate. We've seen a decrease in illiteracy, so we can measure the impact of activities, but it's also a way of avoiding stigmatization of such illiterate population to ensure that they are better informed about what they should have access to. And so we're using using this data to increase mobilization. On the occasion of September the 8th, the International Day for Literacy, and we discuss, make sure that this discussion is a general discussion via communication in various media outlets. And so we have 5 priority actions, so mobilizing the private sector, and that was only made possible because we had reliable data. And we have a direct measurement of literacy, but if we need more granular data, well, this survey makes it possible, so we can really see what is happening on the ground and have comparable data in time and space to have a shared definition of illiteracy. And so the challenge we needed to rise to was to ensure that literacy measurements were direct measurements with the Information and Daily Life survey. This was an uphill battle, but we won that battle, and so this means that we have a granular level of understanding of these issues, and this type of direct measurement can be coupled with proxy measures, so information about access to libraries, dropout rates, etc. And so this gives us information about factors that contribute to illiteracy at local level, and the idea is to end up with a correct mapping of illiteracy in France that will be more granular and more precise than international survey data. And so I wanted to show you a campaign that illustrates the way that we've used this data to raise awareness on these issues. And basically we used ad type campaigns to raise awareness on illiteracy, and we also have a second campaign to illustrate the benefits of having access to lifelong learning in the area of literacy and numeracy. And so I would like to thank everyone who's participated in these campaigns. Thank you for giving me the floor. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hervé, for the presentation on France. It's interesting that you recall that many people who have literacy or numeracy issues are people who are included in our economic life. And it's interesting to see how you address this issue by reaching out directly to employers who have a key role to play in remedial action and in adult education, generally speaking. What's also interesting in your presentation on France is to see how you managed to bring politicians on board. You not only built upon the political will of decision makers, but you also reached out to politicians through innovative means of communication to ensure that combating illiteracy was put high on the agenda in France. So thank you for your presentation, and I'd like to thank our 2 previous speakers. I will now close this second session of the webinar, and I give the floor back to Rakat, who will be moderating our Q&A session. I'd like to recall that you can ask questions in the Q&A tab and ask questions about all 5 presentations made today.
Thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you so much to all the speakers of session number 2 and to counter presentations. Very interesting indeed information around how data and specific type of survey instruments are helping to advocate for funding, but also political will, generating political will, as well as having a more precise data about who are need in the literacy provision in specific. I would like to invite all the speakers of session 1 and 2. Please switch on your cameras, and I will be addressing some of the questions which we have received on the Q&A. And I will start with the first question to the speaker, Professor Ido Gal. And there is a question from Elizabeth Gerger. And the question is as such. Numeracy is embedded in local knowledge, cultural practices. In addition, programs target specific areas, as you have mentioned. Could you comment on how international assessments take into account these huge differences, also considering countries in the global south? Ido, over to you. Please.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the question. I was just typing an answer while Rahat started to read this. So, of course, you point to an important issue. I would take a slightly different approach. Some parts of numeracy are culturally embedded or relate to local practices, but some parts of it are a bit more global or cut across different countries. Some of the examples, for instance, that our colleague Hervé showed from France can be found in many countries in more or less the same way. And so in developing an internationally comparative assessment, the way to handle it is, first of all, to include in the development team people who are aware of and sensitive to the many different ways in which numeracy is used in different countries, so that there are a variety of items that appear to be sufficiently locally relevant, but also comparable across countries. And in addition, there is an extensive process of translation and adaptation, cultural adaptation, that is used in order to ensure that the items actually speak to the local customs and that they can accommodate different nuances that are specific to one country. This, of course, does not cover all possibilities, and so some countries may wish to add additional localized questions for the survey, maybe develop additional surveys that are suitable for low literacy populations or populations that have specific cultural contexts, because all tests have some limitations, and this is true also of PIAC. But certainly, I can tell you, I spent a few years ago 2 whole days with our translation team talking about how to translate certain items to Arabic and to Russian in Israel when we did PIAC. And sometimes we spoke with people who speak the language and ethnographers and so on. So it's a long process, and if it is done right, at least some of the concerns in this region.
Thank you so much. Ido, I think we have lost the last part of your response. Maybe if you do not mind, you can also type it in the chat box. But the important thing is that, okay, you're back. Would you like to repeat the last sentence that you have been, you will cut out? Yeah.
Sorry, Rahat, were you asking me to repeat the last couple of sentences?
Yes, because you were not audible well. Yeah.
My apologies. So I'm just saying that certainly we need to be very aware of the possibility that not all tasks that come from one country will be relevant in other countries. And the way to approach it is not necessarily to eliminate all the questions that are not suitable for some countries, but to have a diversity of questions and to adapt them to local circumstances. So in internationally comparative assessments, there are very elaborate adaptation guidelines that permit countries to take some latitude in translating and replacing stimuli and photographs and words and number systems and so on in order to be more suitable for our local populations.
Thank you so much for repeating your response. I would like to now invite Nicola. There was one question from Clinton Robinson, and this is related to the today's speakers and their presentations, especially regarding the country presentations. And I would like to repeat the question. It is most encouraging that literacy assessment in the countries presented now uses a level-based or continuum approach rather than a literate and illiterate threshold. But how to do with this in lower literacy environments? The countries presented today are all OECD countries. Could you please respond to this question in brief?
Merci, Rakat.
Thank you, Rakat, for this question, and thank you for this relevant question that I'm sure that Professor Gall could have answered too on the numeracy front. But what I find interesting here is to answer your question is to look at the situation of countries that carry out international and national surveys. Why do countries that already participate in costly international surveys feel the need to carry out national surveys? Well, often it's to have a clearer understanding of low skills in numeracy and literacy, because indeed international surveys don't give that level of granularity for low skill population, and so there are specificities in terms of language or context or regional disparities, and in very highly standardized surveys that type of information does not reflect.
Second part of the answer is that, as we saw with LAMP, and which we don't have with PIAC or STEP, the thing is that it is possible to set up tools that are international, but based on the idea that they won't necessarily cover the full skill spectrum. That's to say, they will try to focus specifically on the lower end of literacy and numeracy skills. There are various ways of doing this, either as you get with Minilamp, or if you avoid asking questions that distinguish between different levels of the high end, what you can do is come up with ways of focusing on those that are weakest in literacy and numeracy. There are systems that enable you to ask verbal questions. That's to say, avoid the problem of illiteracy so that you can get the most accurate level of, or the most accurate measurement of literacy and numeracy levels. Thank you.
Merci, Nicolas.
Thank you, Nicolas.
I will go to the next question. And before going to the next question, I would like to remind the participants that please raise your hand so that I can see, and you can take the floor and raise the question directly to the speakers today. Before I see one hand up, Salihu Kasimu. You can unmute yourself and please specify who your question is directed to. My colleagues have to help me with the unmuting. Right. Yes, over to you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, I'm Salihu Kasimu from Kano, Nigeria.
Welcome.
Yeah, I'm just joining now. I was having issues with my network, so I just joined you people now.
Great. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to have a little issues on youth and adults. That is adult content. That is the definition or the scholar view of an adult. That is my question.
So if I understood correctly, your question is about how do you define youth and adult literacy? Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, for this question, I think we have, thank you so much for your question. Maybe we can ask from the countries, because the way that they defined already, they presented it, starting from France, Ireland, and Korea. How do you define literacy and numeracy of youth and adults in your countries? Anyone from the countries would like to respond to? UNESCO, of course, will have its own response, but I would like to give floor to the countries. Colleen, would you like to
Sure,
respond?
thank you. In Ireland, I suppose there's a difference that is made between secondary and kind of post-secondary. So youth, tends to look at kind of, below 18, and then adult is kind of 18 and above. And then I suppose Ireland has benefited in the past from the PISA kind of assessments of kind of school-aged youth literacy. So that tends to kind of concentrate on math and literacy amongst kind of school age going youth up to kind of the age kind of really kind of 15 to 18. Ireland has kind of a legal situation that individuals are required to remain in education till 16, but then we do have individuals who we would classify as early school leavers, and they tend to be around that kind of 15 to 17 age. So that's the youth literacy is usually kind of before 18 and looks at kind of the standard in terms of kind of reading, writing, and mathematics. Adult literacy, as I kind of spoke of in my presentation, but some of you didn't get a chance to join us. Adult literacy looks at the spectrum of literacy, numeracy, and digital skills, but it also looks at kind of softer skills around confidence. So I run an organization called the National Adult Literacy Agency. So our definition of literacy is quite broad in terms of looking at, as I said, literacy, numeracy, and digital skills. And it tends to be then from kind of 18 up. There has tended to be a concentration in assessing literacy, particularly for adults, and cut off around 64, 65, but now increasingly Ireland has a very, has a considerable aging population. So we need to find ways to kind of measure those older cohorts as well. But in essence, there's an age distinction between kind of 18 below for youth, 18 above for adults, and then literacy for adults is a very broad definition encompassing both kind of the cognitive and kind of softer skills. So that's the Irish position.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Maybe Mr. Erbe or Ms. Park would like to respond to this question. Mr. Hervé Fernandez, would you like to define what youth and adult literacy is in the context of France?
Merci.
Yes, okay, I'll try to do that. Our threshold is the end of compulsory schooling, which is 16 in France. And the entry age has been brought down now to 3. So anyone who is illiterate is someone who went to school, but still can't read at 16. Our first survey in 2004 concerned adults, so 18 to 65. And the second survey, the results of which came in 2012, was for the group 16 to 65. So I would say that our threshold for adulthood and adult literacy is at school leaving age, compulsory school leaving age. And we looked at the root causes of illiteracy and what happens to children. So we were able to have regional breakdown of these surveys. including our overseas territories. So we have some pretty reliable data. When we talk about figures that are directly measured, we also made efforts to ensure that this information was publicized, which wasn't the case in overseas territories up to 2009, concerning youth illiteracy measures. So the public was not aware of those figures, and we found that in those overseas territories, we had figures 3 to 5 times higher than continental France. And because these figures are now being published, I talked about mobilization of a national effort, but it's actually a sum total of regional efforts. We have a highly centralized country, it's true, but we also have policies that are implemented at regional level. Yesterday, we had the second round of our regional government elections, and all of those authorities use the sort of data that we provide them with, so they can ensure that at regional level there are efficient policies for illiteracy. And to ensure this, we have contact points in each region. Up until now, this was not a full-time effort to fight illiteracy. Now we have a change because we've been given the resources to repeat the survey, so it'll be slightly different going forward. And the second decision that's so important for us is the additional resources we've got so that we can recruit full-time people who are part of the national team, but now spread over all our different regions. And this, of course, will strengthen our influence out in the regions, and we'll be able to step up our efforts to fight illiteracy around the country.
Merci. Maybe I think will be Ms. Park. Would you like to also take it up this question very briefly, if you can? Thank you.
Okay, so basically for us, we don't exactly define youth because we focus on adult literacy at this institution. And so by adult, as I mentioned in my presentation, we mean 18 and those of 18 and above. And usually in Korea, we define youth as those, we have a basic act on youth that defines youth as those between 9 to 24. However, usually we define youth up till 18. And in terms of defining the numeracy, the adult literacy survey, by literacy, we actually include numeracy into the definition of literacy. And for that, we don't exactly have a definition for numeracy. However, in those surveys, we mean numeracy as in the basic ability to count and calculate, very basic calculation.
Thank you so much. I think I see also the response from Colleen of the specific definition in Ireland in the chat box. Please consult that. And for the UNESCO's position on that, I have also posted on the chat box from the UNESCO recommendation on adult education and learning 2015 document, page 17, the very specific definition of literacy. Idugal, you would like to respond as well?
Yes, thank you. I just want to add something which I think is important regarding the definition of adults and youth and so on. When we look outside of developed or high-income countries, in many low-income or medium-income countries, there are very high dropout rates of youngsters from schools. Some of them drop as early as 4th grade, 6th grade, 8th grade, and so on. And for all practical purposes, they are outside of the reach of a regular formal system, but they are still not considered adults. They do not participate in adult education. And these can be sizable percentages in some countries. And so the problem is that if you look at the indicators for SDG 4.1, which is about school mathematics or school reading, and SDG 4.6 for adults, there is a middle group that doesn't really fit very well into any one of them and requires other kinds of means of reaching it. So PISA for Development, for instance, which was an OECD initiative, tried to reach some of them, but by definition, they are hard to reach because they are outside of formal schooling and they do not necessarily even fall into regular sampling frames for adults because of the way national official statistics offices work. So I think that this requires some more thinking from UIL and other organizations on how to deal with this population, which are millions of people in some countries that fall in the cracks in some way.
Thank you so much for your response as well. So I have actually, as we are waiting for some, okay, I have another person who is raising their hand. Clinton Robinson would like to raise the question to the speakers. Clinton, over to you, please. Annapurna, please, can you help us to unmute Clinton? Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, here I go.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, and thanks to all the presenters for their very rich presentation. It's been great at 3 a.m. here in Vancouver. It's kept me wide awake, so that's great. I'd just like to come back to the question of policy, which is the framework for our discussions today. I think there are two basic premises that I think we've mentioned, but perhaps could do with some emphasis. That is that the lifelong learning framework and the Sustainable Development Goals, which we have mentioned. I think both these frameworks really push us to deal with literacy no longer as a standalone phenomenon. And I think one of the dangers of having a session on literacy as such is that we forget that actually literacy is only as valuable as the purposes it serves and the benefits that people can draw from the use of written communication. And it's not a standalone phenomenon. And I think the references to functional literacy and to illetrisme in French do emphasize this. So in terms of data, in terms of assessment and the kinds of data that we need to collect, I think there's a set of data that we must give some emphasis to. When we focus on the learner, we want to have effective policies. We want those policies to be effectively implemented in programs that actually do result in improved use of written communication, literacy, if you like. And to do that, as Hervé Fernandez mentioned, we do need a finer analysis. And that analysis seems to me that we need to collect data on context, on the purposes why people need and use written communication, on the languages that they use. That has not come out across the three national contexts, particularly that were presented today. So we need, in addition to quantitative data, we need qualitative data, perhaps based on ethnographic methods and detailed approaches. And the policy framework, to come back to policy again, the policy framework will be one that enables those kinds of surveys, detailed analyses at local level to take place. I wonder what the speakers, how the speakers would react to that proposal.
Thank you so much, Clinton. I think I would like to allow at least very brief 2 sentences each, if you can respond to the question which Clinton has raised. Then we have to wrap up, unfortunately, because translators cannot stay longer. So anyone would like to respond to the question which Clinton has raised?
I'm happy to do so very quickly.
Yes,
I wholeheartedly agree with Clinton, and it's something within NALA we have been advocating for in terms of looking at more kind of qualitative and kind of local assessments. I think the challenge ultimately, it tends to be resources, time, and there tends to be a need in terms of assessment to look for simplicity as opposed to complexity. But that is the approach that we're advocating for with the development of the indicators for the 10-year strategy that I mentioned, that it would take account of the complexity, the local, and as you say, the kind of more qualitative anthropological.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for this response. Anyone would like to respond? Otherwise, I would like to go to the next one. Clinton, we do agree with your observation that the topic itself and the presentation today, we try to capture as much possible at this point. This is the first webinar, we can't keep having the whole day to discuss about it. And we do recognize that we are not really separating youth and adult literacy from the frameworks that you have mentioned about lifelong learning as well as SDG framework. But at some point we need to narrow down, as we are talking about just now, fine-tuning and identifying specific issues and discuss. And hopefully in the future we'll be responding to some of these questions raised today, also in the future webinars on the very specific question. I would like to raise one question to especially a National Literacy Service. This is France and Korea. Is there a participant is raising, is there a recommended timeline to conduct a National Literacy Service? Would you have any response to the specific timeline or recommended timeline for conducting National Literacy Service? Maybe Ms. Park would like to take up this question.
We don't necessarily have a recommended timeline, but for our surveys, it is conducted on 3-year basis, just to look at the progress more effectively. And the survey itself takes about 2 months because we conduct it by face-to-face and on paper-based. However, we're trying to, because of the COVID and other digital issues, we're trying to make it into more digitally accessible format in the future. But for now, it is paper-based, and we say our recommendation is 3 years because it is easier to see the changes in such a period of time rather than having a shorter period of collecting data.
Thank you so much. Mr. Hervé Fernandez, what would be the recommended timeline, or how often do you conduct the EBQ?
So our experience is the following: 8 to 10 years between surveys. It's probably slightly too long. We would be in favor of a higher frequency, and so I asked the French National Institute for Statistics to put the survey on the agenda in 2015, and it's only last year that a study on illiteracy is envisaged within the AES survey. So it's now included in this European survey, and the good news is that the frequency is every 5 years. So that means we'll have up-to-date information every 5 years.
Merci beaucoup. We will go to the next session, and I would like to thank all the speakers and all of those who have raised the questions in writing as well as here on the panel. And we had a lot of questions of our own. Unfortunately, we cannot complete all of it. And I think this is the beginning of a very interesting webinar topic. And we hope to hear more from you. And please contact our colleagues here, and Nicola Jonas, as well as myself. We'll be always happy to respond to your questions, but also connect you to our brilliant speakers today that we had privilege to have, Ms. Colleen Dube from Ireland, Ms. Min-Song Park from Republic of Korea, and Mr. Hervé Fernandez from France. And of course, our professor from University of Haifa in Israel, Ido as well, and my colleague, Nikolai Jonas. And thank you so much to all of the speakers. And I would like now to go to the next session, if you allow me to do so. Thank you. Before we go to the closing remarks, and I would like to ask my colleague, Annapurna, to start a poll survey. We would like to very quickly collect some information from you, from the attendees or participants, to respond to the questions which we have on the screen right now. So please help us complete this poll. The questions are both in English as well as in French at the same time. So we have 3 questions. It will be very good to have at least half of the participants of this webinar to respond to these questions. Okay. Annapurna, would you be?
Rakat Annapurna is having difficulties.
Okay.
Technical difficulties, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Can
Did we get any response to the poll? Or do we have any data which we can show right away?
It is coming in. Maybe you can continue and I'll share the screen once we have it.
Thank you so much. We are very sorry because we have technical issue, as you can as you have heard. I would like now to come to the closing part of our webinar. Unfortunately, we had a lot of questions but couldn't respond, and so I would hope that in the next future webinars we'll have more time for discussion and the answers questions. I would like to invite our director, Mr. David Tachonera, to make a few closing remarks to this webinar. David, over to you. Hello? Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, you are audible and visible. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Rakat. Dear colleague, probably you will appreciate the fact that we wanted to demonstrate, to close this webinar, the importance and the relevance of direct surveys, but I think that we're also experiencing some of the challenges of this approach. But let me try to actually stress some of the outstanding, I think, remarks and points that were actually shared during the discussion. Maybe I will shift to French for my concluding remarks.
De clôture. First of all, I wanted to highlight some of the key issues addressed by our speakers this morning. Let's start with Ireland. The Irish experience shows the relevance of the whole of government approach. The French term is pan gouvernemental, so a cross-cutting approach, which is indeed essential from a policy-making point of view in order to promote literacy, but it's also essential in the creation of monitoring and assessment tools. So the idea is to ensure that all relevant ministries and units are involved in this cross-cutting issue. During the IRIS presentation, comments were also made about the link between skills acquired during schooling and the way those skills evolve once young people have left school and enter the labor market. And so the challenge is to see to what extent work contributes to developing skills. And this indeed points the finger to the role of employers in further development of skills after schooling. Then we saw the case of Korea and France. And in these two examples, we saw the impact of demography on literacy and numeracy skills. So in Korea, the aging phenomenon was mentioned, and also the issue of migration, which was also highlighted in the French experience. And it was interesting to see that in France, the situation was slightly different to that in Korea. Indeed, the surveys showed that literacy issues well, in France, aren't specifically linked to the fact that French was not the language spoken at home under the age of 5. So it was interesting also to see the correlation between literacy and numeracy rates and employment rates. Indeed, in a number of countries, OECD countries, but also non-OECD countries, those populations that are foreign-born often have a lower rate of employment and therefore are facing social and economic inclusion challenges. And that may be compounded by literacy and numeracy difficulties. And so it would be interesting to cross information from literacy and numeracy surveys with labor market surveys, employment surveys. So during our discussions, I think a number of issues emerged as crucial. First of all, the importance of numeracy that is often neglected, despite the fact that it is an essential area of skill, and probably more than ever now that we are in a digital world. And so it is therefore essential to include the numeracy aspect in our skills assessment surveys. Second issue that emerged from our discussion, the importance of direct skill measurement for basic literacy and numeracy skills. That must include lightweight tools such as Minilamp for countries that do not have the resources to roll out complex surveys that often require a lot of financial and human resources. And I think that we're on an interesting route here, and we will explore further with some of the countries that have joined us today. I also wanted to build upon the examples given by the three countries today that show the importance of granular information, having information close to the ground, having information that you can trend over time, but also in space. And that's important indeed, because in a number of countries there may be large differences, large variations from one area of the country to another. And this is a key information in terms of assessing the efficiency of literacy policies on the ground, taking into account territorial inequalities. And this is an issue that needs to be addressed in national surveys. I think as we draw to a close, I think it is important to work towards a mainstreaming of such surveys that requires greater financial and national resources dedicated to such surveys. The UIL will play its role in providing support to countries who wish to adopt this approach, and we will also draw upon the experience of countries that have already engaged in such surveys, such as the countries we heard today. And Minilamp, it can be a useful and affordable tool to engage in this direction. To close, I would like to remind you that the UIL will continue the discussion on this issue on the occasion of further webinars where we will go into greater detail on these issues. I would like to thank you all for your active participation. Thank you to our experts who joined us today to discuss and share their experience. Mrs. Dube, Mrs. Park, Mr. Fernandez, and Mr. Gall. You have provided us with extremely precious insights on the occasion of your presentation. So thank you to all, and I wish you an excellent day or evening, depending on your time zone, and we look forward to meeting you again to further discuss this issue. And I hope that for some of you we will actively support you in the rolling out of skill surveys in youth and adults. Thank you. See you soon.
Merci, David. And I would like to also add one more thank to the list. Is thank you so much for the interpreters for a wonderful job that you have provided today, and hope everyone had no problem with the interpretation in English as well as French, as I did. Thank you to the team who organized this webinar, as well as to speakers. And of course, behind the background, we have a lot of colleagues who are supporting the webinar. We will be happy to have you in the next webinar series on the issue of better data for improved policies as well as programs. Nicola, thank you so much, everybody. Nicola, do you have anything to say for at the end, or we are good to conclude the webinar?
On peut terminer le webinaire sur ces mots. Merci encore à tous.
I think we can now close on those words, and we hope to see you soon.